Welcome to a comprehensive video about the settlement of England and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. I have also made a video about Anglo-Saxon society and advancements, so I hope you also enjoy that after this.
In 410 AD, the Romans withdrew from Britannia, and then slowly went into decline due to the Germanic tribal invasions. From this time onwards in Britannia, it is known as the Dark Ages. Much less is written down, and what is came from the church. So take all of this period with a pinch of salt. It is true, however, that the immediate effect of the Romans leaving Britain was the catastrophic effect on the Romanised natives. The once thriving Roman cities and towns went into decline. Bathhouses and churches became ruins for homelessness, and the Romanised Britons are just having a horrid time. Some Roman trade routes would survive for a time, most likely for the tin in Britannia, however this would also diminish. It's most likely the southern parts of the island as well as any urban settlements that suffered the most, while the northern and more rural areas across Britannia were less Romanised to begin with. There is archaeological evidence that some Romanised Britons did continue to develop their settlements even after Roman withdrawal. However, this would have become much harder for them over time due to the lack of military protection. These communities would have needed to fend for themselves, and local Romanised Briton leaders may have become petty kings of their small towns. Berdoswald is considered to be one such of these fortified centres. This video will cover a general timeline of 410 AD to 860 AD, only going off track if needed. The main sources we will be using are the writings of Gildas the Wise on the ruin and conquest of Britain, a deeply religious Christian who was not writing history, but instead a polemic. He used Christian scripture to tell history through religious stories based on parallels rather than real accounts. And he's well known for being the first British historian, if you can call him that. His writings combine some historical facts and people, but it's mostly about moral viewpoints. His writings are useful because they're the most contemporary source available. He came from what we now call Strathclyde and fled to Gaul, now what we call France. When he came back to Britannia, he brought a whole library with him and became a beloved and famous teacher. Next we have the Venerable Bede and his writings of the classical history of the English people and the reckoning of time. A respected monk of Christian bias who focused much on the aspect of telling history through stories and accounts to legitimise his king and, most importantly, his own personal Christian viewpoints. He is known as the father of English history because his writings are just that important. They are the best sources at the time, but it's still pretty bad and unreliable. He's very biased towards Christian viewpoints and overly dismissive and anti those who do not share his same religious views. He also heavily relied on Gildas's writing for a timeline. And finally we have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by various monks. It's very good but was written a bit too late and lacks detail. It's most likely biased towards House Wessex. This is because it was created under King Alfred by his monks. We'll also be using other contemporary manuscripts such as the Lankunga and medical text. We'll also be able to use the writings of Romans and Greeks about the Germanic tribes such as the Angli, who were the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons. Here we can use sources such as references to Britannia from other parts of the contemporary world, such as from Rome, contemporary archaeology, the weaving together of educated guesses based on myths, and other modern day historian and expert opinion and knowledge. We will never fully understand what happened during this time period, hence why it's called the Dark Ages. However, we can extract what we do know and compare them to the oral myths to build the best possible picture. This is why I love the early Anglo-Saxon period. We only have little bits and bobs, much of it woven into fairy tale and legend. It leaves a lot of it up to our own interpretation and makes it a wholly unique period in British history. Obviously some will be annoyed by this and just want to know the truth, but I love the oral histories and cross-fertilisation on spats of facts so that we can draw our own narratives. The narrative I will spin is as historically correct as possible, while not disregarding oral histories and legendary tales like many modern historians like to do. This is because I strongly believe that there may be some truth in these stories, we just don't know how much.
The last bastion of Celtic culture at this time was in Britannia, who, with the help of Germanic migrations, managed to lose the interest of Rome, who withdrew. Gildas wrote that no sooner were the Romans gone than the Picts and the Scots, like worms which the heat of midday came out of their holes, hastily land again from their canoes, inspired with the same avidity for blood. The Romanised Britons pled for help from Rome, stating that the barbarians drive us into the sea, and the sea throws us back on the barbarians. Thus 2 modes of death await us. We are either slain or drowned. but Rome was unable to send help due to their own Germanic problems. So instead, the Romanised Britons turned to the Germanic mercenaries, who helped them against the still pagan and Celtic Picts in the north. However, upon seeing this green and pleasant land, the Germanic mercenaries decided not to take their money and leave, but instead take the place of Rome.
Many of the native Britons had grown used to Roman life, but with the withdrawal of the empire, this life had become harder to obtain. Imagine now if the electricity was cut off, you had no heating and needed to learn to hunt again. Many Britons were struggling to adapt to pre-empire life. Many towns and temples built by the Romans were now abandoned to become refuge for the homeless. And from the decay of Roman civilization, older Celtic traditions saw a revival. The rural areas of Britannia did not Romanise much, with Briton Hill forts standing even during Roman rule, and they'd now outlasted it. They likely gained many refugees from the now unfunctional Roman settlements. The adaptation would have been harder for those living in the south of Britannia, as this is where Roman rule was most poignant, although Roman life would have still flourished in small communities. Celtic and British gods also saw a revival and were worshipped alongside Latin gods, although Christianity was still dominant, with an added mix of Druidry rituals. Britannia was now broken up again into many Briton tribes with petty kings that Gildas described as tyrants, allowing for the Germanic tribes to invade on a more equal footing. Many ancient Celtic tribal borders reformed, replacing the Roman borders. However, we can't be 100% sure of the borders at this time. Religion during this time is very hard to measure. There were Christians in Britannia at the time, which was brought over by the Romans. Because the British Isles were a group of islands, the culture of Italian Catholicism found it harder to maintain cultural dominance here, and some British Christians thought differently. This period of a religion is vaguely grouped together and is known as Celtic Christianity. It was distinctive from Catholicism in many ways, from art to worship. There is a synthesis between Christian beliefs and indigenous pagan traditions. Even under Roman Christianity, many Celtic pagan cults and rituals still survived, and some historians speculate that there might have been some Druidic circles still practicing. Many Celtic Christians merged some of their pagan beliefs into their Christian lives, such as the worshipping of other gods rebranded as saints, and the maintaining of pagan holidays such as Halloween and Easter. This merging carried on even with the introduction of Anglo-Saxon Paganism, creating a hodgepodge of unique beliefs in Britannia consisting of Christianity, Celtic paganism, and Anglo-Saxon paganism. This belief system lays the foundations of modern Anglicanism. For some centuries, even after Augustine, only the elites of the Anglo-Saxons would become Christian, with the majority of the Anglo-Saxons holding on to their pagan beliefs. The elites converted most likely to ally themselves to the rich Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. I may do a more in-depth video on Celtic Christianity at a later date. However, the Germanics were not the only peoples intrigued by this land. The Hibernian tribes from what we now call Ireland also wanted to fill the power gap that Rome left behind. They set up their own settlements before the Germanics invaded, into the west coast of Britannia. Some of these most successful settlements on the west coasts were in land that we now call Wales. They also settled Del Rita in the land of the Picts. The modern nation and even language of Scotland stems from the Hibernian tribes who settled here, the Scotti. The Picts were in turn either driven down south past Hadrian's Wall by the Scotti, only to be integrated into the Anglo-Saxons, or integrated into the Scotti themselves. The still pagan Picts and Scots caused much chaos. They saw great opportunity in raiding and pillaging land that was once protected by Rome.
The Germanic tribes living in Scandinavia were maritime societies. Much of their survival and exploration depended upon the sea, rivers, and access to clean water. This drove them into building boats, the most sophisticated in the world at the time, and were therefore able to reach Britannia with relative ease. Once these Germanic invaders started to settle in Britannia, we call them the Anglo-Saxons. They are an amalgamation of Germanic tribes from the North Germanic coastline and Scandinavia, mostly Frisians, Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. They are also the sons of Angul and Saxonite. Anglo-Saxon is a contemporary term, used and possibly invented by King Alfred the Great, who called himself King of the Anglo-Saxons. Although Anglo-Saxons such as Bede would have used the term Anglicus, he also sometimes used Anglo and Saxons side by side as an umbrella term. Anglo-Saxon became more widely used around the 10th century, however before then it was used more widely in the continent. For example, it was used by Rome when talking about the new Germanic invaders to Britannia. So Anglo-Saxon is also a contemporary term even before the 10th century and to the period, although towards the end. Other contemporary terms that were used to define the Anglo-Saxons as a collective group were the Anglish or English, particularly by Bede, but even this was a papal term that most likely predates Bede. The Anglo-Saxons themselves, prior to the 10th century, would have thought themselves as belonging to their kingdom rather than as an Anglo-Saxon collective, as Northumbrian, Mercian, or Middle Angles, for example. The Anglo-Saxons spoke a North Germanic language and followed a Germanic paganism more similar to that of the Scandinavian tribes. Anglo-Saxon English or Old English developed from the original Germanic language, as the Germanic tribes who migrated to Britain became isolated from their continental counterparts, leading to a distinct linguistic evolution due to separation by the sea. They were a tactful warrior and seafaring people, once gaining their wealth from mercenary warfare and raiding. They were now enticed by Britannia as an opportunity. It should also be noted that climate change at this time caused many agricultural problems. They needed to find land to farm, so Britannia would have enticed them even more. It would have been a great risk for the Anglo-Saxons to want to migrate to this new mythical land. The Germanics who travelled to Britannia would have done so for countless reasons, including, as before stated, climate change and wanting to farm new land, potential overcrowding in Scandinavia, wanting to start a new life, adventure and excitement, being lower class and very poor in Scandinavia, so nothing else to lose, possible persecution in Scandinavia due to past crimes, stories of a mythical land enticing them, and many more potential personal reasons. Their life experiences would have been much different to that of the Celtic Britons, and even further removed from the Romanised Britons. Many of the Germanics may not have even heard of Rome, and had no first-hand experience of Roman luxury. Most of them likely never saw such big towns before, or even used money. Instead, they would have saw this land as a tool for farming, and forests for timber, and animals to hunt. Britannia, now unprotected by Rome, must have seemed like a paradise. Free land and a new future for those brave enough to sail the sea. John Blair states that, in economic and cultural terms, Anglican England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, makes more sense as the westernmost edge of Scandinavia than as part of the British Isles. Historians estimate there are around 2 to 4 million Britons living in Albion before the Anglo-Saxon migration, many of which may have been displaced by the Anglo-Saxons. The most popular opinion of how the Anglo-Saxons got to Britannia was by boat in the same way as the Vikings. However, the crossing may not be so simple to determine. Many academics now think that unlike the later Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons may not have sailed directly across the North Sea. Instead, whole tribes would have travelled down south along the coast and crossed from Frisia, as the crossing would have been safer. Some evidence of this is that the southwest coast of the British Isles and the northeast coast of the French is known as the Saxon Shore. The Romans set up many fortifications in this area, and it was an official military command under the Count of the Saxon Shore. This suggests that the Anglo-Saxons had been migrating and raiding these areas prior to Roman departure. However, others suggest that it got its name as the Saxons had already begun to land and settle in these areas prior to Rome's departure. So who were these Anglo-Saxon tribes?
Jutes is a Latin variation of the Old English Eotas.
Autas may have referred to giants or great ones, implying that they were either a particularly brawny or tall people.
They may have been the same tribe as the Euphones Franks, who lived in what is now known as Calais, the closest part of the continent to the British Isles, and just across the Channel from Kent, where the Jutes settled. These two tribes share strikingly similar artefacts and artistic styles, and were culturally alike. They most likely came from Jutland, the peninsula that forms part of modern-day Denmark. Therefore, it is possible they travelled down to Calais to make the crossing. This is supported by many historians who speculate that the Jutes were no longer living in Jutland at this point in history, but had migrated south to Frisia and Flanders due to climate change. They settled in Kent and Witwara, known now as the Isle of Wight. Next we have the Angles. They were named after Angul, who was chosen to be king because of his bravery. The name Angul translates to narrow, referring to narrow water. The name Angul also translates to hook, like the kind used for fishing, possibly suggesting they were skilled fishermen, or that their landmass resembled a hook in shape. This led to the term Angaling. The Angles settled along the eastern coast and into the Midlands of what is now England. They established kingdoms like Bernicia, Deira, East Anglia, Mercia, and Lindsey. You can still hear their legacy in place, names that include Anglia or Eng, such as England itself. The Angles, also known as the English, came from a land called Anglia. According to Bede, this country was left nearly empty after the migration. It was located between the homelands of the Saxons and the Jutes.
The Saxons, unlike the Jutes and Angles, continued to maintain a strong presence on the continent even after the migration period. This suggests that they were likely more populous, and that it was mainly the poorer members of society or adventurous individuals who chose to leave. The Saxons came from a region Bede referred to as Old Saxony, and they eventually settled in areas we now know as Wessex, Sussex and Essex. During Bede's time, the term Old Saxons was used to distinguish the Saxons who remained on the European mainland, neighbours of the Franks, from those who had migrated to Britain. They were named after their legendary ancestor, Saxneat. The name Saxon is believed to come from the sayax, a type of knife they were well known for using. Interestingly, after arriving in the British Isles, these knives quickly became shorter, signalling an early cultural divergence. The word sayax itself traces back to the Indo-European root sec, which means to cut. The Saxons settled primarily along the southern coast of Britain, in regions such as Essex, Sussex and Wessex. These areas, along with places like Middlesex, share a common linguistic ending, sex, which is derived from Saxon. It's harder to say exactly how the Frisians got their name, though some believe they may have had a connection to the Jutes. Some linguists suggest the name could be traced back to an old Germanic word, meaning curly or curled, possibly a reference to the choppy waves of the North Sea, or perhaps even to their own curly hair. The Frisians didn't establish any kingdoms of their own, making them harder to place in the historical record. They were likely fewer in number and seem to have integrated into other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, most probably into those of the Angles, as evidence of Frisian presence has been found in nearly all Angle regions except Lindsey. Other Germanic tribes may have migrated as well, including the Franks and Batavians, and there is even some speculation that a few Huns may have arrived. However, their numbers would have been extremely small, likely even fewer than the Frisians, and they would have been absorbed into local populations very quickly. The lands lost to the Anglo-Saxons were known as Lloegyr to the Britons, meaning the lost lands. Although initially unable to expand further, the Anglo-Saxons entrenched themselves in Britannia. Generations of Anglo-Saxons would farm and live in Britannia, which they came to consider their home. Over time, they would expand again into the land they called Wyrlas, meaning foreigner, and is where the modern-day Wales comes from. One of the major battles was between King Ceawlin of Wessex and 3 Briton rulers at the Battle of Deorham in 577 AD. King Ceawlin defeated the Britons, which allowed the Anglo-Saxons to expand further throughout Britannia. This victory also separated the Britons in Cornwall from their allies in the north, resulting in a cultural drift over time. King Ceawlin wasn't the only expander. In the north, King Athelfrith of Bernicia would also defeat many Britons. The most important was the Battle of Catriath in 600 against the Britons, and the Battle of Degsastan in 603 against the Gaels. These 2 victories established the Anglo-Saxons as the dominant people even as far north past the River Humber. King Athelfrith also won a major victory in the Battle of Chester in 613 AD when he attacked the kingdom of Powys and Ross. Bede stated he attacked them because although they were unarmed, they were opposing him through their prayers. Around 1,200 monks are said to have been killed. Bede stated that, although Athelfrith suffered heavy losses, the victory was of huge strategic importance as it separated the Britons in Wales and up north. As for the rest of the Britons living in what we now call England, they were slowly assimilated into Anglo-Saxon culture over many generations. Robin Fleming, a modern historian, says that, more often than not, the native Britons and Germanic settlers talked to one another and settled next to one another. Britons may have preferred immigrant agriculturalists to land-hungry villa owners. The newcomer Anglo-Saxons and natives married each other's womenfolk, and they were buried in the same new cemeteries. Meanwhile, Bede says, in a short time, swarms of the aforesaid nations came over into the island, and the foreigners began to increase so much that they became a source of terror to the native themselves who had invited them. Both accounts are likely true, and may have varied from one community to another. However, I would suggest that there was more division than unity, as mixing different cultures and religions rarely ends smoothly. We can tell where the Anglo-Saxons settled by looking at the place names they left behind, many of which include specific endings that show the type of settlement. For example, Ham means homestead, as in Snottingham, the homestead of Snot, and Birmingham, the homestead of Beorma. The endings tun or tun, seen in Tunbridge and Brighton, suggest a town or settlement. Names ending in ing, like barking or reading, show the settlement of the followers of someone. The endings wich, wick, wich, and wyke also point to a settlement or home, as in Droitwich and Northwich. In the same way, Bury, Borough, Bro and Burr often meant a fort or walled town like Aylesbury or Wellingborough. Finally, Shire, found in names like Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire, show that the area was used for running government or administration. We can also see where Anglo-Saxon settlement was less common by looking at areas with place names of Roman or Brittonic origin. Roman influence shows up in names that include Castor, Cester, Chester or Keter, all coming from the Latin word castra, meaning fort. You can see this in places like Chester or Doncaster. Brittonic roots are clear in names with parts like Tre, Loch, Bryn, Aber, Avon, Pen and Combe, such as Aberystwyth, which point to older Celtic origins that came before or stood against Anglo-Saxon control. The divide between the Anglo-Saxons and Britons can often be seen most clearly in the names of rivers. Places that were more strongly Anglo-Saxon tend to have rivers with Old English names, while areas where the Britons stayed powerful kept more Old Celtic names from Brittonic or Gaulish roots. Overall, we still don't fully know how the two groups interacted. The Anglo-Saxons may have led a full invasion, or they might have lived alongside the Britons in some places. No one knows for sure. The Anglo-Saxons also didn't just occupy the stone buildings built by the Romans, they also built their own new settlements around rivers. The rivers of Albion were vital to Anglo-Saxon migration, and nearly all of their settlements were established around rivers and strategic locations for river-based settlements. While Roman Britannia was built along man-made roads, Anglo-Saxon Angleland was built around natural rivers. There were three main rivers significant to the early Anglo-Saxons: the Humber, the Wash, now largely marshland, and the Thames. The early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were established along these rivers, often using them as natural borders. This highlights not only the importance of nature to the Anglo-Saxons, but also their skill and the central role that boating and seafaring played in their society. So what did the Anglo-Saxons look like? Well, their appearance changed throughout the period, but generally, this is how they looked. Anglo-Saxons had pale skin, which was common because of their northern European roots. Their hair was predominantly blonde or reddish, with some having darker hair due to intermingling with local Britons or other groups. Men valued their hair and beards, often grew long hair and bushy beards, which was seen as symbols of masculinity. They used combs and oils, including butter, to groom and style their hair, and sometimes braided it. Male hair generally became shorter with the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon society. As Christianity spread, it brought new cultural norms, including ones shaped by Roman ways, where shorter hair were often linked to religious piety and humility. Anglo-Saxon women typically had long hair, often braided or styled with ribbons. Married women covered their hair with veils, while unmarried women wore it loose or in simple braids. Hair care was important, with combs used to keep it tidy, which reflected social status and cultural values. Blue or grey eyes were most common, but brown eyes became more frequent as they mixed with the local Briton population. Anglo-Saxon women sometimes used natural materials to enhance their appearance, like herbal washes to cleanse the skin, or oils to keep it moisturised. They also used simple cosmetics, like crushed berries for lip colour, or natural dyes to darken their eyebrows. Anglo-Saxons valued strong teeth, and there is some evidence they practiced basic dental care. Grave finds showed some folks had well-preserved teeth, likely because their diet were low in refined sugars. Anglo-Saxon men were typically tall and muscular, a result of their active outdoor lifestyle. They were trained as warriors and farmers from a young age, leading to strong physiques. Given their active lifestyle, Anglo-Saxons were generally lean and strong. Archaeological evidence suggests that many individuals had muscular builds, particularly men who were trained as warriors. Anglo-Saxons wore simple, practical clothing made from wool and flax. This included tunics, cloaks, and trousers. Warriors might wear animal skins or minimal clothing, especially during battle. Anglo-Saxon clothing was often decorated with embroidery, particularly for the wealthy. Women might embellish their tunics and cloaks with intricate patterns. Both genders wore simple leather shoes, often ankle-high and secured with laces. The quality and decoration of footwear varied depending on social status. The poor, however, may have gone many years without shoes. Belt buckles were commonly worn by males and females. Their metal clothing items, such as buckles, armour and weapons, were highly ornate, showing much skill in metalwork. They were decorated with pagan symbols of nature and stories. It's unknown how widespread this ornatry was. It could have just been the wealthy and elites, or maybe poorer folk also dressed as good as they could. Nobody knows. What is known is that many little masterpieces have been found from all over the Anglo-Saxon world. Were they just better protected? Or were they commonplace? Anglo-Saxon men and women often wore brooches to fasten their cloaks and tunics. These weren't just functional, but decorative too, made from bronze, silver and gold,
often with intricate patterns. Women in particular used elaborate brooches to show off their status. Like the Celts, they wore jewellery, often with animal and spiral designs, but their style were distinct, more practical yet still beautiful. Both men and women wore rings and bracelets, usually made from metal. Wealthier folks might have had gold or silver pieces, sometimes inlaid with garnets or other precious stones. Women often wore necklaces made from glass, amber, or stone beads. Some of these were imported, showing the Anglo-Saxons had wide trade connections. Anglo-Saxon jewellery has been found in abundance, and their impeccable craftsmanship is widely respected. They were truly amazing metalsmiths and craftsmen. Jewellery was something the Saxons were, and still are, well known for, and though grand finds like Sutton Hoo are stunning, even the more common bits of jewellery are incredibly exquisite for the time period. Historians still have no idea how the Anglo-Saxons became so skilled at making jewellery. We see influences from Rome, the Celtic world, Germany, and Scandinavia, but the Anglo-Saxons took all that, mixed it, and created loads of their own unique designs. Jewellery would have been worn for the same reasons as today, to reflect status and for pure vanity. The Anglo-Saxons imported many jewels from all over the world: Indian garnets, beads from Afghanistan, ivory from Ethiopia, and so on. This shows the grand Anglo-Saxon trade networks they set up. Anglo-Saxons often bathed in rivers, streams, or other natural bodies of water. Communal bathing were common, especially for men. In some cases, folk might have used wooden tubs filled with water heated over a fire. Bathing in these tubs were likely less frequent than in rivers, because of the effort needed to heat the water. If it were done, it were probably by richer people. We're not sure how common washing were for the Angles, so they might have been quite smelly, along with having bad breath. But this would have been normal for everybody, so folk wouldn't have taken much notice like we do now. Although they did groom themselves, and even used toothpicks and nose trimmers. So we can assume taking care of one's hair were important to look attractive. They even had ear scoops for wax. The first Anglo-Saxon kingdom was Kent. The name Kent is thought to come from a Celtic word. It likely means coastal district, corner land, or land on the edge. The story goes that a king of the Britons named Vortigern was having trouble with raids by the Picts and Scots. He therefore asked for help from some Jute mercenaries led by Hengist and Horsa. The British writer Gildas said that the proud and foolish British kings were so blinded that in trying to protect his country, he sealed its doom by inviting in the fierce and godless Saxons, like wolves into a sheepfold. He called them a people hated by both God and men. According to Gildas, nothing was ever more harmful or unlucky for Britain. After Hengist and Horsa defeated the raiders, they demanded more payment, but Vortigern couldn't afford to pay them. As a result, the Germanic mercenaries began taking land as their reward. The first Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Kent, was founded around the year 450. However, its rulers were only petty kings, and Vortigern still claimed the land known as Cantium. More and more Germanic warriors gathered behind the two brothers, and by the year 500, the southwestern part of Britannia was firmly under Anglo-Saxon control. However, there is evidence that the Anglo-Saxons had been invading Britannia even during the time of Roman rule. Vortigern was eventually overthrown by the Britons, who were furious about the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. He was replaced by one of his 4 sons, Vortimer. Hengist and Horsa fought against Vortimer, most notably in the Battle of Aylesford in 455. During the battle, Horsa was killed, leaving Hengist angry and seeking revenge. According to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the Jutes, led by Hengist and his son Oisc, won a decisive victory despite Horsa's death. They met again in 457 AD at the Battle of Crayford, where Hengist and Oisc forced the Britons to flee to London. This was followed by 2 more battles, one of which was known as Wippodus Flayot, which eventually led to the Britons surrendering Kent to the Jutes. According to the Historia Britonum, a highly unreliable source, Vortimer managed to drive the Jutes all the way to the western side of the Isle of Man. There was also a marriage between Vortigern and Rowena, the daughter of Hengist, either as a gesture of peace, due to drunkenness, or because of Vortigern's desire for her. Rowena married Vortigern and later poisoned Vortimer, an act of betrayal against the Britons. The Britons were so sorrowful over the death of their king that they carried his body from town to town on his shield in mourning. Vortigern, however, did not grieve. Instead, he reclaimed the title of king by promising he could bring peace with the Anglo-Saxons. Legend has it that there was a peace treaty banquet between Vortigern and Hengist, possibly held near Stonehenge. The Jutes drew their hidden long knives, known as seaxes, and killed all the Britons while feasting with them
as Hengist had still not forgiven the death of his brother. This legend is known as the Treason of the Long Knives. Some say that Stonehenge was built on the site where this betrayal happened, as a memorial by a remorseful Hengist. Ambrosius Aurelianus then became the new king of the Britons. Over time, he came to be known as, or was represented as, Uther Pendragon. There is no contemporary evidence for any of this, only stories and legends. Personally, I consider these accounts to be a form of evidence, as they are all we have, and I believe there is often some truth in stories and anecdotal records. On the other hand, many people argue that the origins of Kent, or the first Anglo-Saxon arrivals, are ultimately unknowable, and that we should not place trust in anecdotal evidence or folklore. No matter which version of the events is true, if any, the outcome was the same. Hengist and his son Oisc became the kings of Kent, the first legendary Anglo-Saxon kings. Their reign laid the foundations for future Anglo-Saxon invasions. Francis Pryor, an archaeologist, disputes the idea of an aggressive invasion, stating that there is no archaeological evidence to support such an event. Instead, he suggests that the Britons may have simply adopted Anglo-Saxon culture without a significant influx of new people. According to Pryor, cultural change does not necessarily require a large population movement. The Anglo-Saxons may have been only a small ruling elite, or the Britons may have gradually shifted their culture over time. Others argue that DNA evidence does show at least some migration of Anglo-Saxons. They suggest that the lack of archaeological evidence for an invasion could be due to a lowering of the Briton population after the Romans left, combined with the fact that the Anglo-Saxons primarily built with wood, which leaves fewer traces behind. Although no written evidence has been found, archaeological evidence suggests that the Saxons may have also settled in Kent, north of the River Medway. However, they were either soon driven out or integrated into the more dominant Jutish culture. Alternatively, this archaeological evidence may simply reflect the high degree of similarity between Jutish and Saxon cultures. What we do know for certain is that, over the years, Kent engaged in trade with the continent, especially with the Frankish Empire. Some scholars speculate that Kent may even have been considered part of the Frankish sphere of influence. In any case, Kent soon became the wealthiest part of Britain, largely due to its active trade with the continent. Kent was also the first Anglo-Saxon territory to become a kingdom and developed a wealthy ruling class more quickly than the other tribes on the island. Kent would later thrive as the centre of Roman Catholicism in England, even establishing abbeys beyond its own borders. During the 7th century, Kent played a leading role in the Christianisation of the Anglo-Saxon world, helping to bring the various tribes under the influence of Roman religious authority, and reforming a Celtic Christianity to align with Roman teachings. Even as Kent's political power was eventually overtaken by Northumbria, it remained highly respected and held significant prestige. This was due to its status as the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom, its possession of Canterbury Cathedral, and its role as the birthplace of Roman Christianity in England. Kent began to decline as a major power following the outbreak of the Great Plague in 664. It is possible that the kingdom lost 2 kings in quick succession, and many villages were abandoned due to the widespread impact of the disease. Further internal conflict within the Kentish royal dynasties, including acts of kinslaying, stripped the kingdom of its moral authority and significantly weakened its religious influence. Other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms took advantage of this instability, leading to further devastation and the erosion of Kent's dominance. The legend of the white and red dragons symbolises the struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons, the native Celtic inhabitants of Britain, during the Anglo-Saxon invasions. The red dragon represents the native Britons, while the white dragon represents the Anglo-Saxons. The red dragon was likely used by native Britons as a military emblem, possibly as early as the Roman period. The white dragon appears in later medieval texts and heraldry as a symbol of the Anglo-Saxons, often in contrast to the red dragon. According to legend, most famously recorded in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, 2 dragons were discovered fighting beneath Dinas Emrys, a hill in Wales. The red dragon initially struggled but eventually defeated the white dragon, symbolising the Britons' resistance against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. The red dragon later became a national symbol of Wales, while the legend itself has often been interpreted as a prophecy of the eventual triumph of the Britons, later the Welsh, over their oppressors, even though the Anglo-Saxons ultimately came to dominate much of Britain. The term Wales originates from the Anglo-Saxon word wal, meaning foreigner. Over time, Wal came to refer specifically to the Britons and anything associated with them. Meanwhile, the Welsh word for England is Lloegyr, which may be translated as either lost lands or warriors, though its exact meaning remains uncertain. The Anglo-Saxons continued to conquer territory throughout Britannia until the rise of a Briton named Ambrosius Aurelianus, who was likely a descendant of the former Roman overlords of Britannia. Ambrosius Aurelianus and his followers were able to hold back the Anglo-Saxons for a time. It is here that the foundations of the Arthurian Legends begin to emerge, making them a form of Anglo-Celtic folklore. Ambrosius Aurelianus is said to be the brother of Uther Pendragon, and therefore the uncle of Arthur. Ambrosius Aurelianus fought alongside the Britons in the War of the Saxon Federates, and defeated the Saxons at the Battle of Mons Badonicus around the year 500. This battle marks the most significant defeat of the Anglo-Saxons by the Britons in history. There is very little to no evidence supporting the existence of a historical King Arthur, and it is more likely that he was a fictional figure created to represent the Welsh struggle against the Anglo-Saxons. Therefore, while there may be some truth behind the myths, they are likely mixed with exaggeration, misinterpretation, and classic storytelling themes of good versus evil. It is also likely that Arthur and the characters within the legends embody a blend of several historical Britons, such as Ambrosius Aurelianus. Some suggest that the plague of Justinian, which occurred around 45 years later, prevented the Britons from capitalising on their victory. Others argue that the Briton tribes were too focused on internal conflict to unite and drive out the new arrivals. I might create a video on the Arthurian Legends at some point. How the Briton tribes during the time of Gildas transformed into a land of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms by the time of Bede, roughly a century later, remains uncertain. As a result, we rely largely on Bede for an explanation of this transition. Although Gildas did not detail what happened to the Saxons following the initial wars, he does mention a division of the country caused by barbarian invasions, which prevented citizens from worshipping at certain shrines. At the same time, he reported that Britain was being ruled by corrupt Briton tyrants, who could no longer maintain law and order. Gildas also observed that, although there was peace from external threats, the land was plagued by internal conflict, rather than war with foreign enemies. Not all was well for the Anglo-Saxons. Not only did they need to worry about getting attacked by other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but the raids from the Britons never stopped. Slave traders from Hibernia, what we now call Ireland, was a huge problem. Even during Roman rule, Hibernian tribes built much of their wealth off slaves taken from their sister island. It should be noted, though, that slavery were a normal part of life for the time, but it seemed the Hibernian tribes were right fond of it. The Anglo-Saxons did not wipe out the Britons fully. Many of the earliest Anglo-Saxon kings likely married Britons to form alliances, so some of the first kings would have had Briton blood in them too. Culture was adopted too, forming a new and unique mix found only in Britannia. A blend of Germanic Anglo-Saxon and Celtic Briton. Plenty of Briton and Roman place names stuck around even after Anglo-Saxon capture. Even full kingdom names like Kent and Bernicia. That shows the Anglo-Saxons took on parts of Briton culture as well. Indigenous Briton ways would have stayed with the Anglo-Saxons, mixed in with German influence. The remains of Celtic-style jewellery and other burial patterns show just how much the Anglo-Saxons took from the native Britons, especially when it came to art. There was a replacement rate of up to 80%, which helps explain why Christianity declined in influence. The Anglo-Saxons were pagans. They were originally Germanic pagans. However, due to the isolation of the British Isles as a group of islands, their beliefs gradually diverged. These distinct beliefs are now known as Anglo-Saxon Paganism. Just as languages such as Old English and Old Norse developed differently over time, so did their religious beliefs. Nonetheless, Norse and Anglo-Saxon paganism shared the same roots and would have been quite similar in many aspects. Germanic paganism was a complex belief system that included both nature worship and ancestor worship. Earliest ancestors likely evolved into gods over time, while other deities came to represent elements of nature, for example Thor. Blood heritage and family were vital to Anglo-Saxon belief and formed the foundation of their values, which were centred around kinship. Anglo-Saxon paganism incorporated and merged with certain aspects of Celtic paganism. For example, if the local Britons worshipped a particular tree or considered an area to be sacred, the Germanic settlers likely adopted these beliefs, as they were similar to those found in Germanic paganism. This includes Celtic Christianity, which had itself merged with elements of Celtic paganism. As all three belief systems coexisted, their stories and beliefs gradually blended over time. The 9 noble virtues are a set of ethical principles inspired by ancient Germanic traditions, particularly associated with modern heathenry and us are true. While not drawn directly from historical texts, they reflect values that were important in early Northern European societies. They are: strength is better than weakness, courage is better than cowardice, joy is better than guilt, honour is better than dishonour, freedom is better than slavery, kinship is better than alienation, realism is better than dogmatism,
Vigour is better than lifelessness.
And ancestry is better than rootlessness.
The 5 main gods were Woden, who gives us the name Wednesday. He is the most well known of the 5. His name means divine madness and fury. There were cults dedicated to both Woden and Odin. To be considered legitimate, all kings had to be descendants of Woden. The English word king comes from kin, meaning shared ethnicity and family. Because of this, Woden was most likely a god for the elite and warrior classes. The Romans connected him with Mercury. He is also linked to ash trees, wood, travel, spears, and the Os rune symbol. Woden was said to lead the wild hunt, a ghostly procession in the sky. Anyone who looked upon it would be carried away.
King Charles III is believed to be a distant descendant of Woden through the ancient royal bloodlines of early Anglo-Saxon kings.
Funor, who gives us the name Thursday, means thunder. The Romans merged him with Hercules. Funor is also connected to oak trees, hammers, and slaying dragons. His worshippers likely wore small metal hammer amulets, much like how people today wear a crucifix. These amulets may have been used not only to honour Funor, but also as a way to speak to the old gods and to protect the wearer from evil. Other weapon-shaped amulets have also been found, possibly representing different gods. Later on, clubs symbolising Hercules were worn, most likely a Roman version of the earlier hammer symbol. Thunder was believed to be the sound of Funor striking his hammer, and lightning was the result of these mighty blows. Tew, who gives us the name Tuesday, is a god we know little about. He is most famous for sacrificing his hand to a wolf in order to help the other gods. He is associated with the Tyr rune symbol and was most likely a god of war. Wolves were seen by the Anglo-Saxons as one of their fiercest enemies, which adds meaning to the story of his sacrifice. Frigg, who gives us the name Friday, is a goddess we know little about. She was the wife of Woden. She may have been known by another name to the Anglo-Saxons, possibly Urs or Mother Earth. Frigg is linked with the harvest, especially the holy month of September, when the Anglo-Saxons made sacrifices. She was worshipped by women who hoped to have children, and they would thank her for safe pregnancies and childbirth. Frigg was said to spin cloth at her spinning wheel, like any good and dutiful wife of the time. Eostre is the goddess from whom the festival of Easter takes its name. She was a goddess of spring, fertility, and the harvest. Her symbol was a rabbit, which is most likely where the idea of the Easter bunny comes from. Eostre was worshipped in hopes of ending winter early and bringing a bountiful harvest. People would offer her eggs and give hot cross buns to one another as part of the celebration. There would have been other gods as well, some worshipped only in local areas. Some gods were unique to the Anglo-Saxons and were not known or worshipped by their Norse cousins. These included Nihal and Nia was worshipped in the Low Countries on the continent and was most likely brought over by the Frisians. She is often depicted with symbols of the sea and a large dog at her feet. Saxonia was one of the many ancestor gods of the Anglo-Saxons. Over time, figures like him were worshipped as deities and gradually drifted into legend. Anglo-Saxon paganism had loads of mythological creatures you might have heard of. Dragons show up in Old English stories now and then, usually as symbols or legends. Sometimes they're seen as enemies standing for chaos or evil. The dragon-slaying tale in the old poem Beowulf shows a battle between order and chaos. Elves called elf in Old English were supernatural beings in Anglo-Saxon myths. Folk saw them as pale, good-looking, magical, and a bit sneaky. We don't get loads of detail about them, but they were seen as godlike. Legends state people could even have kids with them. Elf shot was a common problem back then. People believed little elves shot folks with invisible arrows, causing weird illnesses or pains no one could explain. Ents, like the ones in J.R.R. Tolkien's stories, don't show up by name in Anglo-Saxon texts, but the old pagan beliefs did include tree spirits or nature spirits, which are a bit like Tolkien's Ents in some ways. The word orc, like in Tolkien's stuff, comes from Old English, where it meant a demon or goblin. In old Anglo-Saxon writings, it's sometimes linked with Grendel from Beowulf, though that bit's a bit fuzzy. Truth is, Grendel could have been an elf, or even a tree spirit. No one's fully sure. Water monsters like sea snakes or lake beasts pop up in lots of old myths, including Anglo-Saxon ones. In the Old English poem Beowulf, there's a water creature, Grendel's man, who lives down in a dark lake. Dwarfs, called Dweorg in Old English, were tied to crafting and lived underground. They were known for being top-notch metal workers. Bit like elves though. There's not a lot of detail on what folk believed about them. Other creatures like giants and wizards show up in Anglo-Saxon paganism too, but the growth of that belief system got cut short when Christianity came in. Norse paganism over the North Sea carried on developing on its own path though. I might do a longer video on Anglo-Saxon paganism another time.
Place names like Draca and Thrias, meaning dragon and giant, show that loads of today's myths come straight out of the Anglo-Saxon world. Modern writers like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and even J.K. Rowling took big inspiration from that old lore. Tolkien made Lord of the Rings to be a national mythology for England, a bit like what Geoffrey of Monmouth did with the Arthurian Legends. Together, those two form the backbone of British myth, and they have gone on to inspire later stuff, like Harry Potter. These mythical works pull from real bits of history, helping us fill in the blanks of the Dark Ages while mixing in folklore, values, and a bit of fun. A great way to get a more visual feel for Anglo-Saxon culture is through Lord of the Rings and the Arthurian Legends. Now, they are fantasy, not proper history. But Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon culture, and his books reflect much of this background. I see Monmouth as the Tolkien of his time. Today, works such as these have made British mythology the default all around the world, from Dungeons and Dragons to Game of Thrones. When people think of fantasy as a genre, they most likely picture British mythology in their heads. In 595, Pope Gregory I sent Augustine and 40 monks as missionaries to bring the church back to the new Anglo-Saxons. They got to Canterbury, Kent, in 597. King Ethelbert of Kent was wary at first, fearing black magic, but eventually Augustine managed to convert Ethelbert, who later became a saint. This was most likely helped by Ethelbert's Frankish wife, who was also a Christian. Augustine was then made the first Archbishop of Canterbury, and Ethelbert was the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert. King Ethelbert made Kent the first Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdom. He also set down the first law code, the oldest text written in English, and the oldest law code found in Germanic. Ethelbert weren't just king of Kent, but the overlord, or Bretwalda, meaning Briton ruler, over many other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, so a fair few other kings converted too, for political reasons. Later on, the king gave Augustine permission to build Canterbury Cathedral. Another of these kings was the king of East Anglia, King Redwald, who went on to succeed Ethelbert as overlord. Though King Redwald weren't fully Christian, he held on to a lot of old Anglo-Saxon pagan beliefs. He's still important, as he was buried at Sutton Hoo, in one of the biggest archaeological finds in British history. The Church of England is then one of the pillars of the nation, and has been with it from the very start. Augustine of Canterbury is also extremely important, because without him, this history might never have been written down. Many of the monks who recorded it, like Bede, were heavily influenced by Augustine. Augustine didn't manage to convert any other Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and he got a frosty welcome off the Celtic Christian Britons, likely because Rome were now backing the freshly christened Anglo-Saxons, while the Celtic Christians had been scrapping with them same pagan Anglo-Saxons not long before, and lost their land over it. Imagine fighting in the name of Christ and losing, then your enemy converting, likely for political reasons rather than any real faith, and then told by your head of faith that you're the wrong type of Christian. The Celtic and original Christians of Britannia were completely abandoned by Rome. The practice of collecting and preserving body parts or relics of saints was common in early Catholicism. The Anglo-Saxons took to this side of it strongly. These body parts were known as relics and held spiritual meaning. They could be bones, hair, fingers, or other remains. They were often kept in small boxes or amulets. Pilgrims would visit these reliquaries to seek blessings, healing, or a spiritual link to the saint tied to the relics. The most well-known are those of St. Cuthbert. Part of being a Catholic at the time was going on a pilgrimage, something loads of people did, even kings. It were also the closest thing you'd get to a holiday back then. Rome was the most prestigious place to go, though you had to be rich enough to make the trip. The three main pilgrimage sites in the early Anglo-Saxon world were Lindisfarne, known for St. Cuthbert's relics, Glastonbury, tied to St. Joseph of Arimathea and early Christian legends, Canterbury, home to the shrine of St. Augustine and its historical weight. Canterbury is still a popular pilgrimage site for Christians today. This period is known as the Heptarchy, meaning the rule of seven, representing the main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at the time. Heptarchy comes from the Greek word hepta, meaning seven. The four most powerful kingdoms were East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex, and the three lesser kingdoms were Essex, Kent, which we've already been over, and Sussex. There were other kingdoms, however these were governed by one of the powerful seven most of the time. It should also be noted that these flags are just to add visual dual coding for educational purposes. Although most of the heraldry in the flags could be traced back to Anglo-Saxon times, they were not used as real flags. We'll now be covering the history of this heptarchy in as chronological order as possible, minusing Kent because we've already been over them.
The way kings worked was quite unique to the Anglo-Saxons. A king from an Anglo-Saxon and Briton point of view was a reflection of his people, and came from them like a son from his parents. You can see this in the way a king's title was written. Ethelbert was known as the King of the Kentish in English,
Ethelbert Kentsuning in Old English, and Rex Ethelbert Cantware in Latin.
This meant Ethelbert weren't just ruling Kent, he was Kent. His name tied him straight to his people, not just by land, but by blood and duty. He stood as a living symbol of the Kentish folk, speaking for them and standing with them. When folk said his name, they weren't just talking about a man, they were talking about the whole identity of Kent wrapped up in one person. Although nowadays we have a mix for two, Anglo-Saxon kings were kings of the people, not necessarily tied to the land. They weren't lords of the land, but leaders of a people. To the Anglo-Saxons, land ownership and kingship were two very different things. A strong example of this was during the time of the British Empire. We weren't citizens of the empire, we were all equal subjects under the crown. There were no passports or anything like that. Those were continental ideas. Sadly, we're no longer subjects of the crown, but British citizens, a shift that goes against much of our heritage. This change wasn't made all that long ago. The UK moved toward a model of citizenship, set in law through acts like the British Nationality Act of 1948. The king had both rights and duties, each rooted in his role as a servant and symbol of his people. One of the key rights a king held was the power to raise taxes. This wasn't just for luxury or personal gain, it allowed him to fund the defence of the realm, maintain his household, and reward loyalty. It also gave him the means to support the church and uphold law and order across his territory. The right to tax was seen as a practical tool of kingship, but it only worked if the people accepted his authority. With those rights came serious responsibilities. First and foremost, the king was expected to protect his people and their property. This wasn't just military defence, though that was part of it. It also meant keeping peace within the kingdom, settling disputes, and stopping theft, raids, or violence. He was also responsible for enforcing the law. The king wasn't above the law, he was the law's guardian. He made sure justice was done, that courts ran properly, and that those who broke the rules faced consequences. His authority meant nothing if he didn't uphold fairness and order.
A king didn't rule from a castle or a palace. They were more nomadic in nature, constantly travelling across their kingdom to build trust, show authority and wealth, and collect taxes. This way of ruling was known as itinerant kingship, or simply travelling kingship. They had royal residences, known as royal villas, where they could stay and carry out official business. The most well-known example is Lloegyr. But kings didn't just stick to these places. They would often stay with loyal subjects when needed, especially in areas where they needed to strengthen alliances or maintain peace. Kings would follow regular circuits between their royal villas, making sure all parts of the kingdom felt their presence and authority. They didn't pause their duties while travelling either. In fact, many kings held law courts on the road. Some even built small raised stages so their people could see them in action, delivering justice and showing they were doing their duty. All these royal locations, wherever they went, were usually centred around a great hall, or sometimes several halls, which acted as the heart of the king's court and power. While on the move, hunting parties would often take place, not just for food, but for a bit of fun, and over time hunting became seen as a proper royal pastime. Itinerant kingship mostly came to an end around the Norman period, as kings began to settle in fixed castles and royal centres. However, hunting carried on as a royal tradition, since it was already well established in Europe and fit neatly into the Norman way of ruling. Gilda said Ambrosius Aurelianus brought about 50 years of relative peace between the Anglo-Saxons and Britons, though during that time the Anglo-Saxons also started settling up north. Bernicia was likely one of the first places settled by the Anglo-Saxons. During Roman occupation, the Romans used to hire Germanic tribesmen to man Hadrian's Wall. These were called foederati. On their time off, these Germans would live in the communities south of the wall. After their service was done, they'd either head back to Germania or settle down in what would later become Bernicia, possibly bringing their families over with them. Gildas sometimes called the Saxons foederati, so they likely had some kind of tie to Rome. It's likely that once Kent was set up, plenty of Anglo-Saxons saw Bernicia as a welcome place to settle. Bernicia stretched further north into what we now call Scotland. It would have included what we now call Edinburgh. Idar became the first king of Bernicia around 547 AD. Bernicia is likely a Celtic name taken on by the Anglican settlers from the tribal name Brigantes. Bamborough was the main stronghold.
It's likely that some of the Roman Germanic warriors settled in Deira too, though not as much as in Bernicia. Ella became the first king of Deira around 560. Bernicia was seen as the senior kingdom of the two, and so held a lot of sway over the kingdom of Deira. Deira is a Celtic word, a bit like the Irish place name Derry, and it could be referring to water or oak trees. York was the main town, known as Ioffawick, a very significant place. It was the capital of the north of Roman Britannia, known back then as Eboracum. During the Roman period, the Romans invited a Germanic tribe known as the Alemanni to Britannia. They were a Saxon tribe and were most likely invited to defend the province from other Germanic raiders. The Alemanni adopted Roman-style military tactics and farmed the land they were defending. After the Roman Empire, Anglo migrants arrived in what we now call East Anglia, or the Kingdom of the East Angles. The Angles were skilled warriors and clever, using the rivers to their advantage. East Anglia was pretty much a marshland at this time, and the Angles were highly adept at manoeuvring around it. The Alemanni, instead of fighting against these new Germanics, joined them. They married together very quickly, so much so that they were later seen as East Angles. So the East Angles were a bit different to other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, because they were a mix of Angles and Alemanni, though the newer Angles would have been much more numerous. Dunwich was the main trading town of the Kingdom of the East Angles, but the harbour and most of the town have since disappeared due to coastal erosion. Dunwich was likely less important as the port of Ipswich became more popular over time. The Romans had built a lot of infrastructure to stop the landscape flooding and make more farmland accessible. The East Angles largely ignored this infrastructure, letting East Anglia become more and more marshy. Despite this, the East Angles slowly grew their territory to the west and got into numerous conflicts with the Middle Angles. The East Angles used the marshlands as a natural defence system for their territory. Lloegyr was the first king of East Anglia. The name Lloegyr might have been a hypocristic form of Wistan from the poem Beowulf. His son, King Wulfr, was much more documented, and their dynasty, the Wulfingas, ruled East Anglia until its annexation by Mercia in the 8th century. Some speculate that the Wulfingas were connected to the Swedish dynasty, the Scilfings.
The origins of Essex are harder to track the history of.
According to Barbara York, who I owe a lot of gratitude to for this book, the Saxons started settling Essex around 450 AD, but there were less of them, so they coexisted a lot more with the Britons. Essex was originally part of Kent. However, the two kingdoms quickly split, most likely due to the geographic divide of the Thames River. This left many smaller East Saxon communities all acting independently. However, the kings of Kent likely had a fair bit of sway in Essex before they came under their own king. Barbara York reckons they might have stayed a minority, which was rare for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, so they may have been a ruling minority class in Essex. The Historia Britanum stated that the territory was ceded by the Britons after the treason of the Long Knives, so this was probably why they were able to rule as a minority. They were most likely more peaceful than the other Saxon settlers. The name Essex came from the name East Saxons, meaning East Saxons. Essex included Middlesex, much of Hertfordshire, and at times the sub-kingdom of Surrey. The Middlesex and Hertfordshire parts were known as the province of the Middle Saxons. Middlesex itself was a considerable powerhouse, as the trade capital of Angleland. Their main capital was Londonwick, now known as London. Modern archaeologists are a bit puzzled about Essex particularly, because of the scarcity of artefacts and pagan tombs outside of Mucking, a Romano-British settlement. This again suggests that the East Saxons were a ruling class over the Britons, and kept themselves much more separate from the natives than other Anglo-Saxon tribes. They used the Britons as farmers to toil their land, but not for coupling or mixing with. The biggest divide early on would have been a religious one, between the Celtic Christian Britons and the Anglo-Saxon pagan East Saxons. These Essex tribes came together under King Esgwin in 527 AD. Although some sources state that King Sled was the first king of Essex around 587 AD, Cybert of Essex was the first Essex king to convert to Christianity. However, it seemed the East Saxons didn't take to Christianity as quickly as some of the other kingdoms. During the plague of 664, even though it hit every kingdom, Essex was singled out by Christian writers saying they brought the plague on themselves for being reluctant to become Christian and angering God. Essex was a more decentralised kingdom with local rulers having much greater authority. It could have had a different type of government altogether, maybe split up into smaller regions. For example, King Sexred, King Sayward, and another unknown brother all ruled jointly after the death of their father, Cybert, in 616 AD. This lack of structure and centralisation is most likely what led to them being politically dominated by the other, stronger Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, mainly Mercia, until Wessex took over.
After Hengist and Horsa's occupation of Kent, Ely and 3 of his sons sailed to Kimansora and fought against the local Britons. These were the land and people of the kingdom of the South Saxons. Bede wrote that the other Germanic migrants held Ely in high esteem, most likely because of his deeds back home. Ely was the first king recorded by Bede, who also stated that Ely was the first overlord, at the time called Bretwalda, of the Anglo-Saxons, showing that from the start of invasion, the Anglo-Saxons might have been more unified than we often think. Sussex under Ely might have stretched all the way up to Oxfordshire. During Roman occupation, Chichester would have served as the closest thing to the area's capital, but it was mostly abandoned after the Romans pulled out. So it's unknown where the seat of power lay in Sussex, or if there even was a single place. In 491 at Pevensey, the Saxons slaughtered the Britons to the last man. Around 500 AD, the Battle of Baden took place. Here, Ely or Cerdic of Wessex faced the Britons, some say against the legendary King Arthur, though it was likely just a Briton king or chief. The man said to be King Arthur defeated Ely and the South Saxons. It was a major victory for the Britons, halting the westward push of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a time. The Heistingers were one of the more notable Anglo-Saxon tribes who settled in what's now known as East Sussex, as they gave their name to the town of Hastings. They're believed to be a different people to the South Saxons, most likely a Jutish tribe who came over from Kent, but they arrived fairly late, around the 6th century, showing that Sussex might have been less populated or more scattered, or both. Sussex was one of the last Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to adopt Christianity, and were overall more isolationist. However, the Heistingers were already Christianised before they migrated over. In the later years, Sussex got pushed around by Kent, Mercia and Wessex, and ended up being de facto ruled over by these other kingdoms. After Hengist and Horsa took over Kent, Cerdic and his son landed in what would become Wessex, the home of the West Saxons. Jutes were actually the first Germanics to settle in Wessex since they settled in Hampshire, but same as in Kent, the Jutes and Saxons might have been much closer in culture than we reckon. Either way, the Jutes were either driven out or ended up mixing into the wider Saxon culture. Cerdic might have stepped into a position of leading Wessex, left behind by the Romans, after killing off the Briton rivals, mainly one known as Natanliod. King Cerdic is the earliest recorded ancestor that our current royal family claims descent from, though Cerdic himself said he descends from Angul and Woden. He's also the earliest point most English folk can trace their ancestry to with any real certainty. However, Cerdic might not have seen himself as a king, just a tribal leader, his tribe, the Yerwizi. He also coincided with, and there are many theories about Cerdic within and around the Arthurian Legends. Some say he was represented by Arthur, some by Mordred, Arthur's enemy, and others by one of Arthur's knights, Sir Curadoc. Around 500 AD, the Battle of Baden took place as part of the War of the Saxon Federates. Here, Cerdic or Ely of Sussex faced the Britons, some say against the legendary King Arthur, though it was likely just a Briton king or chief. It was a major victory for the Britons, halting the westward push of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a time. Mercia was settled by sailing down the River Trent. It was founded as the Kingdom of Iclingus around 515 AD, most likely after King Aesul, but later came to be known as Mercia around 600 AD. Mercia meant march, which at the time meant the borderlands. This most likely referred to the border between the Angles and the Britons. Their first king was Aesel, king of the border folk, who claimed, unlike most, to be from a royal line back in Germania. He was said to be the son of the last Anglic king. Mercia was constantly at war and in skirmishes with Northumbria and the Welsh. Mercia seemed to have adopted a much more complex political structure, that's sadly been lost to history. In its early days it may have been much more fragmented than the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a good while. The first named united Mercian king was Creoda in 585 AD, who is known for building a great fortress called Tamworth, which would go on to become the political centre of Mercia. A good case could be made for certain kingdoms being led by dynasties with some Germanic ancestry or ties, but also having origins in, or intermarrying with, native British elites. This would explain why some kings, like the Mercian ones, had Briton-sounding names rather than Anglo-Saxon ones. In 560 AD, King Ceolin played a major role in turning Wessex into a powerful kingdom by expanding its land, stretching all the way to the Bristol Channel. Wintoncester, modern-day Winchester, would later become the central seat of power for Wessex. Ceolin's great-grandson Cynuggles was the first of the dynasty to convert to Christianity, and he was also the first to be officially recorded as King of Wessex, though it's possible the title had been in use earlier. The histories of Bernicia and Deira were murky at best. But somehow King Ethelfrith of Bernicia managed to conquer Deira, maybe killing King Ethelric in the process.
This led to Ethelric's brother Edwin
Becoming exiled.
temporarily joining the court of King Radwald of East Anglia. This shows how interconnected the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were.
Ethelfrith therefore became the first king of both Bernicia and Deira. Ethelfrith was an Anglo-Saxon pagan. There is a famous story of 100 Christian monks praying for his defeat in battle. To take his revenge, he later ordered for them all to be beheaded. After about a decade, he was attacked by King Radwald and killed. Radwald thereafter placed King Edwin on the thrones of Bernicia and Deira.
East Anglia in its early days were a significant power.
Edwin fled to King Redwald for support when his kingdom got took over.
When Ethelfrith offered to pay Redwald a large sum of money for Edwin, Redwald refused. Redwald of East Anglia then managed to defeat their much larger cousin Ethelfrith in the Battle of the River Idle in 616 AD during Edwin's exile. Edwin later regained his kingship, and King Redwald, around 600 AD, became Bretwalda over all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms south of the Humber River. The famous Anglo-Saxon helmet found at Sutton Hoo belonged to King Redwald. However, East Anglia's power slowly diminished and it ended up as a pawn between Mercia, Wessex and Northumbria. Religious infighting between Anglo-Saxon pagans and Christians were the most likely reason East Anglia diminished so quickly. Hundreds of East Anglians were taken into slavery and sold off to the continent, mostly to the Franks. It were mostly rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Mercia or Northumbria that captured and sold East Anglians, either after battles or raids. This state of affairs carried on in East Anglia till Ealdwulf found himself on the throne. Instead of carrying on the fighting, Ealdwulf managed to unite his people and secure alliances with other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which let the East Angles defend themselves a bit better. Upon the death of Edwin by Cadwallon of Gwynedd, who was allied to Penda of Mercia,
Bernicia and Deira were split between Edwin's kin, King Osric of Deira, and King Enfrith of Bernicia, both of them pagans.
King Cadwallon of Gwynedd carried on raiding Deira and Bernicia, killing both Osric and Enfrith. Gwynedd, for those who don't know, was a Welsh kingdom. Therefore, King Oswald, Enfrith's brother, united Deira and Bernicia into a new kingdom, known as Northumbria, in 634, after a long stretch of raids. King Oswald was originally an Anglo-Saxon pagan. However, after growing up in Dalriata up in Scotland, because of the strife back home, he'd converted to Briton Christianity, not to be confused with Celtic Christianity. Briton Christianity and Catholic Christianity differed mainly on how they dated Easter. It was called Northumbria because it sat north of the River Humber. Bamborough, the main stronghold of Bernicia, went on to become the most important seat in Northumbria. Northumbria was constantly at war and caught up in skirmishes with Mercia, Strathclyde, the Picts and the Scots. King Oswald accordingly placed a huge wooden crucifix in the ground before a battle against the Welsh, and with the grace of God managed to win back and unify the two kingdoms. He held it tight with both hands and shouted for his army to pray to God Almighty for their just war, for the safety of their nation. Bede stated that folks sliced bits off the wood of this cross over the years, mixing it with water to make it holy. This led to the Battle of Heavenfield in 633. King Oswald won, defeating the Welsh forces led by King Cadwallon of Gwynedd, securing control over Northumbria and reuniting Deira and Bernicia under his rule. Northumbria would split for the final time upon Oswald's death, when at the Battle of Maserfield in 641 he was killed by Penda of Mercia, where his body was chopped into pieces and stuck up on stakes. However, one quick assassination reunited it again permanently under Oswald's brother, Oswiu, in 654. The Venerable Bede described Oswald's tomb, where they hung up over the monument his banner made of gold and purple. It's likely this description led the medieval heralds to give Bernicia arms with 8 stripes, red and gold, one after the other. It's said that in the Middle Ages the same colours were flown by the first Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy. King Oswald had the gold and purple flag over his tomb, which likely led to the creation of the modern Northumberland flag. The purple most likely changed to red later on, since purple dye cost a fortune back then. An important event that many overlooked was the Yellow Plague of 664. It was an epidemic that struck the British Isles, and is the first recorded plague pandemic in British history. As it came at the same time as a solar eclipse, there was a lot of superstition surrounding it. The Yellow Plague was the Black Death of the Anglo-Saxon period. It caused heavy loss of life, threw society into turmoil, and led to a drop in religious faith, lasting as long as 25 years. The disease was likely plague or smallpox.
Irish and English sources said it hit Ireland first, then spread through the British Isles. Folk even reported an earthquake in Britain during that time. Bede wrote, "A sudden pestilence depopulated first the southern parts of Britain, and afterwards, attacking the province of the Northumbrians, ravaged the country far and wide, and destroyed a great multitude of men. This plague prevailed no less disastrously in the island of Ireland. Many of the nobility and of the lower ranks of the English nation died. A domnan of Iona, an Irish abbot and saint from that time, said the plague swept through all of the British Isles, barring a large stretch in what's now Scotland. The Yellow Plague took many lives of important historical figures." In 643 AD, Cynugul's son, Cenwal, king of Wessex, soon came under the direct influence and control of Penda of Mercia, due to Mercia's rise in political and military dominance. Cenwal married Penda's sister, likely under pressure, but later cast her off, stirring up trouble. As Bede recorded, "For he put away the sister of Penda, king of the Mercians, whom he had married, and took another wife. Whereupon a war ensuing, he was by him expelled his kingdom." Cenwal was forced into exile in East Anglia for 3 years before getting back his throne. After Cenwal's death, his wife Saxbor, possibly Penda's sister as well, ruled for a short while. She might have been the only queen regnant, not consort of the Anglo-Saxons, reigning for about a year. Her rule shows both sharp political sense and strong support from her powerful family. Mercia grew quickly in power. Edwin and Oswald were both directly or indirectly killed by Penda, king of Mercia, in battle. Penda was a pagan, and after defeating his Northumbrian rivals, he became the most powerful king in the British Isles, and he disliked Christianity. Mercia itself was allowed to expand, unlike other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and it needed to keep a strong military due to having many borders. For centuries, Mercia and Northumbria fought for dominance, with no major victor until King Penda and his son Ethelred. Penda set Mercia up for dominance, while his sons built upon his success. King Oswiu later sought to revenge his brother Oswald in the Battle of the Winwed in 655 AD against the Mercians. The Mercians had greater numbers but were defeated by King Oswiu and the Bernicians. Penda was also killed in this battle, and Bede marked this as the final defeat and downfall of Anglo-Saxon paganism, and it led to the conquest of Mercia. Oswiu split Mercia into two. He controlled the northern part, which slowly became part of Northumbria. Penda's son, Payada, pledged allegiance to Oswiu and gave him tribute, and ruled the south of Mercia. However, Payada was killed in Easter, around 5 months into his reign, by his own queen. Oswiu therefore tried to rule all of Mercia directly. However, the Mercian nobles were not too fond of this new Northumbrian king. They drove out Oswiu's governors in a revolt, leading to the installment of King Wulfhere in 658. Although Wulfhere still paid tribute to Oswiu, this was likely just to keep the peace, as Northumbria no longer had any governance over Mercia. Although by this point Christianity was dominant, the many different Anglo-Saxon churches couldn't agree on everything, like key dates and whether to celebrate Easter or not. In Whitby, 664, King Oswiu aimed to settle this debate. All the major religious players met in Whitby to discuss whether the Anglo-Saxons should side with the Celtic Christians or the Catholic Christians. This came to be known as the Synod of Whitby. Oswiu sided with the Catholics. After that, Northumbria became part of the Catholic fold. Catholic education flooded into the area after this, and Monk Wearmouth, Jarrow Abbey, opened round that time, famous for educating Bede and where he did his writing. This sparked the Northumbrian Golden Age, known for its rich monasteries and high levels of education, including the writing down of much of what this very video is talking about. Lindisfarne was another notable monastery, which produced many great works, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels and maybe the Book of Durrow, that had a strong influence on British Christian artwork, like the later Book of Kells. During the Golden Age, Kings Edwin, Oswald and Oswiu, between the years 616 and 654, were the overlords of Britannia and dominated the other Anglo-Saxon and Celtic kingdoms. York were chosen as the second seat of the Archbishop because of this dominance, though York Minster weren't built just yet. Ecgfrith, feeling strong from his dominance, decided to push north into Pict territory, leading to the Battle of Dun Nectan in 685. Although the Picts won this battle and massacred nearly all the Northumbrians in a swamp, including King Ecgfrith. Mercia took advantage of this and pushed north into Northumbria, while Northumbria would scrabble for leadership over the next couple of generations. Wulfhere expanded south into the Thames Valley and gained much influence in Surrey, Essex, Kent, and as far down as the Isle of Wight. By the end of Wulfhere's reign, Mercia was the biggest and most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Ethelred took advantage of Egfrith being slain in the Battle of Dan Nectane and managed to take over the whole south of Northumbria after the Battle of the Trent. Northumbria had as many as 11 different kings in this same time period, showing its instability. In 686 AD, King Cadwalla became the first to formally take on the title King of the West Saxons, likely after asserting his rule as Bretwalda over the various West Saxon tribes. Before his reign, Wessex had been run by underkings, who Cadwalla eventually put down and removed, showing that Wessex might have been less unified than some of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Alternatively, these underkings might have been rival factions from the wider West Saxon royal line, locked in power struggles among themselves. Either way, under Cadwalla, Wessex became fully centralised for the first time, or maybe re-centralised after earlier breaking apart. King Ian used this power to defeat the Briton kingdom of Lloegyr around 710 AD and annexed it. He was highly religious and invested in building many churches and monasteries around Wessex, as well as his own legal code. However, he put his religion above his kingly duties and decided to abdicate and go off to Rome. He left no heir, basically leaving Wessex at the whim of their powerful neighbour, Mercia. By around 730 AD, Ethelbald of Mercia dominated Wessex and most of the other South Anglo kingdoms, and Wessex carried on being dominated till the death of Offa. It's likely because of King Ian that the monarchs of England swear never to abdicate, even to this day. King Ian built a house in Rome with taxes from Wessex. This area were known as Schola Anglorum or Schola Saxonum, since many Anglo-Saxon pilgrims lived in this part of Rome. Over time it became an Anglo-Saxon enclave. It mostly had schools, houses, chapels and militia buildings. The area is now called Borgo, which comes from the Anglo-Saxon word bur, meaning fortified settlement. The house later came to be known as the Saxon School. Though it was later burned down by Muslims, part of it still stands and is now called Santo Spirito in Sassia. The school stood on the spot that's now where the Church of Santo Spirito in Sassia stands. By 716, King Ethelbald managed to dominate all of the South Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, mainly Kent and Wessex, starting off the time known as the Mercian supremacy. During this time, Mercia was the most powerful kingdom in Britannia. Ethelbald made huge leaps in unifying the Anglo-Saxon world. For example, other southern kingdoms had to get royal assent from Ethelbald for a law to count, though there were rebellions, especially from East Anglia. Some historians speculate Ethelbald could have centralised things a lot more, but he chose not to, letting the other kingdoms keep a fair bit of independence. Ethelbald was also the longest reigning Anglo-Saxon king on record. King Offa was the next notable Mercian king. At the start of his reign, the Mercian dominance had faded, but Offa managed to turn it round. Under Offa, the Mercian supremacy reached its height, and Offa managed to centralise things a lot more. One big example of this was the penny. Offa's gold dinars had the Islamic Shahada on them, while he looked like a Roman emperor on his penny. This was cause he used coins from the Islamic and Roman worlds as templates for his own, without really knowing what the symbols meant. Other rich and powerful nations used coins like that, so he did too. It was his way of consolidating power and showing that Mercia was one of the big boys. Offa is many people's favourite Anglo-Saxon king after Alfred the Great, mostly because of the power and influence he wielded. In many ways he could even be seen as a forerunner to Alfred. One of Offa's boldest moves was creating the short-lived 3rd Archbishopric in Lichfield, showing just how far his authority reached. He also took steps to curtail the Welsh raids. Much like the Scots and Picts up north, the Welsh were constantly raiding into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and making a nuisance of themselves. Offa took inspiration from Hadrian's Wall and built a dyke, known as Offa's Dyke, along most of the Welsh-Mercian border. Offa's dyke stretched 177 miles and was made to stop the Britons from raiding and thieving from Mercia. It was also a political move, letting Offa compare himself to the powerful Roman emperors. The sheer scale of it makes it one of the most impressive earthworks ever built in Britain. He also took inspiration from the Franks, especially Charlemagne. The two even took part in friendly diplomacy. This shows that Charlemagne saw Offa as the most important man in Britannia. Offa worked hard to make himself seem equal to Charlemagne. At one point, Charlemagne wanted one of his sons to marry one of Offa's daughters, which shows the massive respect not just for Offa, but for England itself by that time. The Mercian supremacy died with Offa, and after him, the kingdom ended up ruled by fairly weak kings. The Mercian decline weren't helped by some newcomers. The Viking raids along its whole eastern coast. Alliances and political frameworks that once let the Mercians control those areas were torn apart by the Vikings, leading to Mercia's collapse in power. After the Mercian supremacy and death of Offa, Wessex got much more politically adaptive and managed to take in much of that old power.
This mostly kicked off in 825 with the Battle of Ellendun, where King Egbert of Wessex won a decisive victory against Mercia. Egbert himself was born in Kent, but had to live in Wessex because of Mercia's dominance. The Battle of Ellendun is seen as the death knell to the Mercian supremacy. After this victory, Wessex expanded, annexing all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms along the south coast.
Egbert didn't stop there. He pushed into Mercia in 829 and forced King Wiglaf into exile.
He then forced his way into Northumbria and made it submit, making Wessex and Egbert the overlord at that point. That only lasted about a year though, till Mercia rose up in revolt. It was during this time that small Viking raids started picking up steam, making the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms more erratic and less stagnant. Viking comes from the Old English word Vikingar, meaning pirate, and in the early days they were seen more as a nuisance or punishment from God than any real threat. Egbert and his sons fought against the Vikings and did a proper good job, nothing like what telly shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom make out. Egbert and his son, who'd later be King Ethelwulf, fought the Vikings on more than one occasion.
Egbert's grandson and King Ethelwulf's son is Alfred the Great, who we'll be talking about a lot more in a later video. Right now though, we're talking about Egbert's granddaughter, King Athelwulf's daughter, and Alfred's sister, Athelzwith.
Athelzwith married the Mercian king Burgred in 853, bringing an end to the fighting between Wessex and Mercia, the two strongest kingdoms in England. This marked one of the key beginnings of a more united England. The new invading force, the Vikings, known to the early Anglo-Saxons as the Danes, who we'll be speaking more about later, might have pushed the English to stand more together. The two kingdoms even started using a shared coinage system, strengthening London's place as a major mint and trade hub in this still loosely unified England. Wessex also backed Mercia directly in their wars against the Welsh, likely showing once more that the English were starting to see themselves as one people, though this was still just cooperation, not proper unification. A full uniting weren't likely even in the minds of the Angles back then, as it was still common and accepted for kingdoms to be split between sons after a king's death.
Athelzwith's father, Athelwulf, was actually planning to split Wessex up when he died, just like his own father had done. The practice of dividing a kingdom among a ruler's sons weren't tied to a single written law, but came from a tradition known as partable inheritance.
When Athelwulf came back from his pilgrimage to Rome, he did so with a new wife, Judith of Flanders. King Athelwulf's son, Prince Athelbald, weren't happy about his father's plan to split the kingdom after his death, and he led an open revolt against him, ruling over about half the kingdom with a fair few powerful allies behind him. This almost sparked a civil war in Wessex, but they came to a deal instead, agreeing to rule the kingdom between them, Athelwulf taking the west of Wessex and Athelbald the east. When Athelwulf died, the kingdom stayed split between two of his sons, Athelbald and his brother Athelbert, King of Kent, who seemed to get on well enough. Athelbald also took his father's widow, Judith of Flanders, as his new queen consort. From this point on, Wessex turned its attention to the constant Viking raids. It was strange that the Romanised Britons couldn't pull themselves together under one banner. Not that long before, they'd all been ruled under the single banner of Rome. But instead, local leaders and maybe some of the villa nobles went off and did their own thing. That might show they never truly saw themselves as one people, even after near on 370 years of Roman rule. This total failure to come together and work as one would be what led to their downfall. Gildas wrote, "It was always true of this people, as it is now, that it was weak in beating off the weapons of the enemy, but strong in putting up with civil war and the burden of sin." The Britons were mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon writings, but it were rare and scattered. When they were, it were only as raiders or folk on the edge of the kingdoms.
They weren't talked about much inside the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which suggests folk didn't really see them as Britons anymore. When the Britons living in an Anglo-Saxon kingdom hadn't fully fitted in, and folks did mention them, they were called devils. Like in the life of St. Guflac, where a mob of them went after Guflac. There were stories of Brythonic kings knocking about in and around Northumbria, but those tales are even less trustworthy than what we've got on the Anglo-Saxons.
This could suggest that some of the native Britons managed to rise up in the Anglo-Saxon world, maybe even to the point of becoming kings. There were also accounts of some Christian Britons still living in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, worshipping Christ in secret up in Northumbria, before the Anglo-Saxons themselves converted. The best bit of evidence we've got comes from two law codes, one from 602 and another from 619, out of Wessex and Kent. That's where the tax payments of the foreigners were laid out. Please note that I'm unsure how to pronounce most of the following, but I'm trying my best.
After the Anglo-Saxon invasion, many Celtic Briton tribes still held on. Hen Ogledd, or the Old North, meant parts of northern England and southern Scotland, where Brittonic peoples kept their roots, even as Anglo-Saxon power spread. Regd sat around what's now Cumbria, where folk spoke a Cumbric dialect, close to Old Welsh. It was later taken by Northumbria. Strathclyde, once known as Alt Clud, was founded by the Damnoni during Roman times. After raids from the Vikings, Scotti and Picts, folk moved south into the old lands of Reged. That new patch came to be known as Cumbraland.
Gododin was around where Edinburgh sits now. They might have been moved there by the Romans, who often brought friendly tribes closer to the border. They were descended from the Vutadini and stood as Roman allies for a time. Like the others, they faced heavy raids from the Picts and Scotti, and were later taken by Northumbria. Elmet was around what's now Yorkshire. It didn't last long and was taken over by Deira. The Picts were a mix of tribal folk living north of the Hen Ogledd. They weren't Romanised and mostly stayed in the Highlands, in what we now call Scotland. The Scotti came over from Ulster in Ireland and settled in the kingdom of Dalriada. They spoke a Cew Celtic language, different from the Brittonic tongues spoken across mainland Albion. Further south, the land was known as Cymru, meaning kinsman. They saw themselves as descendants of the Hen Ogledd. Their forefather was Cunedda, who settled in the north of Cymru, though they didn't worship him like the Anglo-Saxons did their ancestors. Cymru and the Hen Ogledd would have seen each other as kin. Gwynedd sat in North Wales, and still stands today as a county. Gwynedd was a Roman successor state that came up in the 5th century in northwest Wales, right as the Anglo-Saxons started settling Britain. Its rulers often stood out as King of the Britons, but they often lost grip through civil wars or invasions. Pangwern, a petty kingdom near the Welsh border in what's now Shropshire, was likely the early seat of Powys kings before they shifted to Mathraval. Not much is known about its beginnings or exact spot. In the 7th century, the Powys prince, Cynflan ap Cynthroin, ruled Pengwern and joined forces with the Mercian king Penda against Northumbria. They faced off against Northumbrian king Oswald at the Battle of Maescogwi, Oswestry, in 642, where Oswald was killed. Dyfed, once known as Demte, had Irish roots and covered Pembrokeshire and parts of Carmarthenshire. It faced Irish raids in the 4th century, and forts went up along the River Taff for defence. In the 7th century, Dyfed lost Ystrad Tiwi to Ceredigion. The old Irish tale, The Expulsion of the Daci, tells of Eochaid, who fled across the Irish Sea. His kin went on to rule Dyfed. Gwent rose out of old Roman settlements and ancient tribes like the Silures. It was the most Romanised bit, sitting between the rivers Wye and Usk from the 5th century on. Brycheiniog was an independent kingdom in South Wales during the Anglo-Saxon period. It teamed up with Mercia to hold a central patch that was key for control over the region. Ergin covered western Herefordshire and parts of Monmouthshire. The English later called it Archenfield. Glywysing covered the Vale of Glamorgan, Bridgend, Cardiff and parts of the valleys. Powys stretched over most of what's now modern Powys and parts of the West Midlands. It was ruled by a dynasty that claimed descent from both the warlord Gorfern and the Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, and many more besides, but as you can see, these folk were still very tribal and spread out, with no strong central rule. Dumnonia was the kingdom in what's now Cornwall. The turning point for them came at the Battle of Durham. 3 Briton kings died that day, and with them went 3 key Briton towns, Bath, Gloucester and Cirencester. The loss of those 3 Roman towns cut Dumnonia off from the rest of the Briton tribes. From there, their culture began to shift and grow more separate, more their own. Dumnonia had many scraps and battles with the Angles in what's now called Devon. Dumnonia fell at some point, and by the 9th century, Cornwall had taken its place, likely due to the strong campaigns of Ecgbert of Wessex. In 825, at the Battle of Gyfulford, Ecgbert brought Cornwall fully under Wessex rule. The Cymry tried to take back the Hen Ogledd from the Anglo-Saxons, but they couldn't manage it. For a powerful account of one of their efforts, please read the poem Awy Gododin. There were other smaller Brythonic and Welsh lands too. Some folk fled Britain altogether, heading to what's now France. There they formed Brittany. Others made it as far as the Iberian Peninsula, though those were fully absorbed in time. But Brittany held on to its Celtic Briton roots for centuries. The term Bretwaldas, also known as Overlord, meant sovereign of Britain, the most powerful king who stood above the other Anglo-Saxon rulers. It also meant wide ruler, a king who held sway over a large stretch of land and power. It's a bit like the king on the Iron Throne in Westeros. It got a bit muddled though, because we don't really know if these guys were just kings of big patches of land,
or if they actually held de facto overlordship over the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It most likely depended from king to king. The term weren't always used the same way either. Some lesser kings got called Bretwalda, while others, proper mighty ones, never were. Like the kings of Mercia for instance. They were never called Bretwalda in the records, but these days we still give them the title, since they did act like overlords in truth. King Ely from 488 to 514, known as the first recorded king of the South Saxons, and possibly the first Bretwalda, he led early Saxon conquests in southern Britain. King Ceawlin from 560 to 592, a powerful ruler of Wessex, he expanded west and north, fought major battles, and was named a Bretwalda for his dominance over other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. King Ethelbert from 590 to 616, first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity, he welcomed St. Augustine and helped spread the faith through southern England. King Redwald from around 600 to 624, a strong ruler of East Anglia, known for balancing pagan and Christian beliefs, and likely buried at Sutton Hoo in a grand ship burial. King Edwin from 616 to 633, ruled Northumbria, united Deira and Bernicia, converted to Christianity, and was seen as a powerful overlord across much of Britain. King Penda from around 626 to 655, a fierce pagan warlord of Mercia, he challenged Northumbrian power and held dominance over much of southern England through battle and force. King Oswald from 633 to 642, a devout Christian king who reunited Northumbria, brought in monks from Iona, and was later venerated as a saint after dying in battle. King Oswy from 642 to 670, brother of Oswald, he strengthened Northumbrian power, won the decisive Battle of the Wynwade, and played a key role in uniting the church under Roman practices. King Wulfhere from 658 to 675, first Christian king of Mercia, he expanded the kingdom's influence across southern England and challenged Northumbrian dominance. King Ethelred from 675 to 704, a Mercian ruler who kept the kingdom strong through diplomacy and war, later stepped down to become a monk, showing deep religious devotion. King Ethelbald from 716 to 757, one of Mercia's most powerful kings, he ruled as Bretwalda over much of southern England and maintained dominance through both force and alliances. King Offa from 757 to 796, Mercia's greatest king, known for building Offa's dyke along the Welsh border and establishing strong ties with Charlemagne, he ruled almost all of southern England. King Cenwulf from 796 to 821, kept Mercia's dominance going after Offa clashed with Kent and Wales and backed the church to strengthen his rule. King Egbert from 829 to 839, first king to briefly rule all of Anglo-Saxon England, he broke Mercian power and laid the groundwork for a united English kingdom. And although this is where this video ends, the next video will be covering King Alfred from 871 to 899, famous for defending England against Viking invasions. He reformed the military and legal systems, promoted learning, and became known as Alfred the Great. King Ethelstan from 927 to 939, first true king of a united England, he secured control over all Anglo-Saxon and Viking lands, and was known for strong lawmaking and forging powerful alliances abroad. Most of the Bretwaldas came from Mercia, with 6 kings holding the title. Wessex followed with 4, then Northumbria with 3. Sussex, Kent and East Anglia each had 1, while Essex had none at all. Mercia held the most power overall, ruling as Bretwaldas for around 180 years. Wessex followed with 82 years, then Northumbria with 54. Sussex and Kent each had 26 years, East Anglia had 24, and Essex never held the title at all. Therefore, although Bretwaldas isn't anything official, I like to use them to demonstrate what kingdoms held the most power in the early Anglo-Saxon period. Thanks for watching. I've also made a video about Anglo-Saxon society and advancements, so I hope you also enjoy that. I hope to see you next time. All the references I used are in the description along with the music links. The music used is by David Chaz, Grendel Sin and Sarah Louise Tilsley, so a big thank you to them.